Alright, welcome guys. This is going to be part 3 of the Proving Guilt series. So in this particular video, I am going to be focusing on murder and assault. But for your knowledge, for the key knowledge area, you have to know about 2 criminal offences. And for each of the offences, you have to know what elements needed to prove the crime, defences to your particular crime, what are the outcomes of your crime, some trends, and then lastly, the impact of your crime. So I would suggest that you study the 2 offences that you have done in class, but generally speaking, for this key knowledge area, you'll get provided a criminal offence or the option to choose a criminal offence, and then you're going to have to know these 5 key concepts here. But like I said, this video here, I'm going to focus on murder and then also assault. Alright, to get stuck in with our murder, it's important we first know what homicide is first. So when we look at homicide, it's generally the unlawful killing of a person, and we have a couple different types. So murder is killing someone with intention, manslaughter without intention, infanticide is when you kill a child under the age of 2, and then child homicide is when you kill a child under the age of 6. But for this video, we're going to be focusing on murder and everything to do with murder. So when we're looking at murder, it's important to know that we need to prove 4 specific things or 4 elements for a person to be found guilty of murder. If one of these 4 things or 2 of these 4 things is missing, then someone cannot be charged with murder. They might be charged with, say, for example, manslaughter instead. And if you do happen to get charged with murder, the penalty is generally imprisonment, and it's imprisonment for a life sentence or generally quite a high period of time, depending on the case. So for the first element of murder, there are 3 people or 3 categories of people that can lawfully kill someone in Australia. Those people is a police officer using reasonable force in the course of duty. And what we mean by reasonable is that it's the only way to maybe get out of a sticky situation. So for example, an accused person is running at a police officer with a gun. The police officer might respond by shooting them. That would be a lawful killing. Secondly, it's a soldier killing an enemy in battle. And lastly, someone acting in self-defense. But just because you defend yourself and kill someone doesn't mean you're automatically off the crime. You have to prove that your actions, once again, were reasonable, and it was the only other way of you getting out of a crime. So if someone is coming at you with their hands and they're trying to punch you, for example, and you respond by pulling out a knife and stabbing them aggressively and they end up dying, that's not really self-defense because it wasn't really reasonable what they were doing. But it all depends, I guess, on a case-to-case basis. So that's the first element of murder. The killing was unlawful. Secondly, we need to prove that the accused actions were voluntary. And what that means is, did the accused know what they were doing? So most commonly, when the accused actions are voluntary, they're awake, they're aware, and they're in control of their actions. So if someone is having, for example, an epileptic seizure whilst they're driving and they veer off the side of the road and kill someone, for example, it could be argued that their acts were not voluntary because they weren't actually in control of what they're doing, so they couldn't actually understand what they're doing. So an example of accused actions being voluntary is that Lola poisoned her husband's dinner with arsenic, which is a type of poison. And that is basically the voluntary action which led to the death. So that's element 2. Moving on to element 3 is that the accused committed acts that caused the victim's death. So from that last video where we talked about that chain, we need to make sure that the prosecution proves that the accused committed acts that contributed significantly and substantially to the victim's death. So we want to make sure that someone's actions was the actual reason that person died to make sure we charge them correctly. So for example, it might be we make sure that we prove that the person's stab wound was the reason that person died. So that's what the prosecution has that burden or that responsibility to do. The last element you need to know is that the accused acted with intent, so often known as the mens rea. So they intended to kill or they intended to cause serious harm. So what this basically means is, for example, they planned out for a while in advance how they were going to commit the crime, how they were going to do this murder. that would be considered intent. Or as a result, maybe they were trying to stab a person, they weren't trying to kill them, but they were trying to cause a serious amount of harm, which led to that person dying, then that element would be present. So generally what happens when you get a murder case study is you'll be asked to apply these 4 elements to the case study. And you need to come up to a conclusion whether a person should be charged guilty or not guilty with a crime. So if we look at this case study as an example, for example, Alfred, who's 18, is mad at Vladimir, 17, because Vladimir told Alfred's parents that he's been taking drugs. Alfred is so mad, he wants revenge, so he puts peanuts in his smoothie, knowing he is anaphylactic or knowing that peanuts will cause serious harm to him, and as a result, he dies in hospital. If we got given this as a scenario, we would need to break down this case study and prove that he either did commit the murder or didn't commit the murder. And we can do this by applying each element of murder. So first of all, we would say that the first element of the murder is unlawful, and that's my blue writing there. And then right after, I'm going to write a linking sentence and write whether or not that element is present or not. Because there wasn't any mention of him being a police officer or self-defense, we already know from that case study it was an unlawful killing. We move to the second element. There was clearly no evidence that his actions were involuntary. He had full control over what he was doing. We can see he was trying to take revenge. Thirdly, the element where the committed acts caused the harm. So obviously if he wasn't given those peanuts and he didn't know about that reaction, he wouldn't have died. So that was definitely the chain or the link between the accused actions and the victim's death. And then lastly, the fourth element is the accused acted with intent to kill or cause serious harm. So obviously because of this case study here, he wanted to get revenge because he had told him about his drug usage. So clearly he had an intent, or he had that mens rea to commit that crime there. And then we can just finish up by saying that all the elements were therefore present and that he should be charged with murder. So if you get a question like, is this a murder case, for example, based on a scenario, what you want to do is you want to apply each of the elements just like I've done here on the screen. So you want to start off by talking about what the actual element is. So first, list the element. After you've listed the element, move on to this green part here telling me whether that element is present or not present. And then finally end up by saying whether all the elements are there and whether you believe that person should be charged with murder or not. Moving on. So how do we get away with murder if we haven't actually done it? So we've got a few defenses to murder. I'm not going to go through all of the defenses to murder. I'm just going to go through the top 3 defenses. But it's good to be aware of them. But if I went through all of them, it would take a little bit too much time. So I'm just going to pick some of the main ones. So first one is nice and straightforward, which is self-defense. So just think of self-defense, basically that you need to have a reasonable grounds to do self-defense. And the only way of you escaping a potential murder is that you had to do this particular action to defend yourself or to defend another person from serious harm. So it's basically your only option to get out of that crime. And then I've got a case study example to explain to you. So for a case study, Jacinta picked up a knife and stabbed a man who broke into her house and was attempting to abduct her child from the baby room. So maybe this situation escalated very aggressively. The person's in the house. They didn't have any other option. They maybe felt like their baby's life was at threat. So as a result, she's done self-defense to save the baby's life. Moving on to duress. Duress is basically when there is a threat of harm unless a person commits a crime. So what that means is you're under so much pressure that the only way for you to get out of that crime is to do something that that person is wanting you to do. But remember, it needs to be a reasonable response. So obviously if someone has a gun to your head, then you need to make sure you take the right actions to avoid getting shot, I guess. So for my example here, Maria's jealous and violent ex-husband, Paul, kidnapped her son from a previous relationship. He threatened to kill the child unless Maria helped him with a robbery. During the robbery, a security guard approached the scene and Maria shot him because she knew if she didn't, Paul would kill her son. So I would say that she acted reasonably to get out of that harm. All right. Our last one is what's known as mental impairment. So in America, they commonly refer to this as insanity, but basically it's the defense exists where if the person was suffering a mental illness at the time, and basically they didn't know what they were doing or they didn't know their conduct was wrong. So it needs to be a diagnosed mental illness. So if you are going to claim this defense in a courtroom, a team of psychiatrists have to prove that you genuinely have a mental impairment and that stopped you from understanding what you were doing or knowing what you were doing was wrong. So for example, Stan killed his mother because he wrongly thought he was going to get evicted from the family. His psychiatrist, so a trained professional, confirmed Stan stopped taking the medication that helped control his impulses and tendency to violence. So he had a mental impairment and as a result committed the crime. All right, moving on, just to almost wrap up murder. So for the trends and statistics for this particular dot point area, you need to know some trends and statistics from Victoria and then one other jurisdiction. So it can be any other jurisdiction, but in this video, I'm going to talk about Northern Territory and New South Wales, but you can use any other jurisdiction as long as the statistics are legitimate. So an example I've got for here, which is specific to just Victoria, is that males were much more likely to commit murder in contrast to females. So 91% of murders in Victoria were carried out by males. So a really good statistic you could use. Moving on to the next one, 73% of offenders were aged between 25 and 54 years old. So generally for murder, it's occurring by people that are sort of in the middle part of their life or adulthood, I guess. Then if I move on and I compare that with some of the statistics of Northern Territory, in 2023, the number of recorded murder offences was quite low in Northern Territory. They had 6 murders in the total across the year. But then the number of homicide and related offences has actually increased from January 2021 to January 2023. So it's gone from 4.4 to 8. Finally, just to wrap up murder, we're going to quickly talk about the impact of crime. So for the impact of crime, you need to know the impact on both individuals and also you need to know the crime impact on society. So you can really talk about anything here. I'm just going to give you some examples, but it would obviously depend on what type of case study example you get and talking about how that particular crime has caused an impact. So obviously for the family, if someone loses their family member to a murder, for example, there's obviously going to be a lot of trauma, grief, and loss. And obviously as a result, you're going to have a lot of short-term issues, but also maybe some longer-term issues. They might need ongoing therapy and counseling, and the whole ordeal of having a family member murdered is going to be extremely traumatic. And you can think about all those domino effects it could also have for the family. So really, really high impact of crime for the family. Moving on for the offender, they're going to feel very guilty or shameful for the death that they have caused. And then most commonly what you're going to see at the end of a murder case is they're going to be in a custodial sentence or they're going to be taken into custody. So they'll be sent to prison for a set period of time. So that's the impact the crime can have on the offender, and they'll have to deal with those consequences for the rest of their life for what that harm they've done. When you bounce over to the community, what we look at for the community is that I guess people can lose safety or they might lose confidence in their community because they might feel like there's a lot of danger. So if there's a murder in their neighborhood, for example, they might feel like they really need more police and emergency services present all the time because they're worried about it happening again. And they also might believe that the legal system's not really doing a good enough job if there's allowed to be a murderer in our community. So I know this is quite a long video. I'm going to move on to assault now, but feel free to pause and take a break as I go on to the last part. So moving on to our second one is assault. And basically assault is defined as when you unlawfully beat or assault someone. It can be direct and it can be indirect, and there's many different types of assault. So you can verbally assault someone, you can spit on someone, you can kick someone. There's lots of different types of assault. Generally speaking, assault is considered to be a summary offence, and the penalty for committing assault is generally around 3 months in prison or 15 penalty units, which is a fine. So each penalty unit at the time of this video is about $192. So obviously it can be quite expensive if you get charged with an assault. So for assault, we need to, like murder, once again, be aware of the elements of this crime. So the first element to assault is that the accused applied force or threatened to apply force. So what that means is if they applied force, they have punched someone in the face. Or if they threaten to apply force, that means they're saying, I'm going to hit you or I'm going to hurt you, for example. That's the first thing that needs to be there. The second thing is that the application or threat of force was intentional or reckless. So what we want to think about with these first two elements is this is our actus reus, and then the second one is more of our mens rea. So did the person intend to punch them, or did they recklessly behave in a way that obviously led to someone else getting hurt? And lastly, nice and straightforward, is that there was no lawful justification or excuse. So basically, they weren't a police officer, they weren't protecting themselves or anything like that. There was no reason or no legitimate reason for them assaulting another person. I'm not going to go through detailed slides about these defenses because I think they're very straightforward and they're very much so a repeat of the murder defenses as well. So just feel free to be aware of them and see how they can apply to different assault cases. Just to almost finish up with our trends and statistics for this one, I've compared with New South Wales. So first one, that in 2022, this was quite higher than I thought, but the total number of recorded assaults in Victoria alone in just 1 year was almost 47,000. So that would be a combination of things like family violence, individual assaults, all kinds of things. Next is that 29% of offenders achieved a term of imprisonment. So most of the people that are assaulting people, about a third, they were going to prison, but their prison sentence was quite short, most of them being less than 6 months imprisonment. When we move on to New South Wales, they actually had significantly more than us. So in 2022, their number of assaults was just over 64,000, so quite a bit more. And that in New South Wales, that was a very high statistic, did not involve a weapon. So 97% of victims stated that there was no weapon involved in the crime. All right, before I go on to the concluding tips, the impacts of the crime, like I said, you do need to know the impact on both the individual and society, but it's pretty self-explanatory. You just need to answer the question based on what your particular case study is. So there's a million different impacts that a crime can have on these two groups of people, but it all depends on the case study that you are provided. So you just need to think reasonably about what would be the impact or the effect of that crime on those particular groups. So to round up this video series, want to make sure that you are aware that you need to know 2 criminal offences. So focus on the 2 criminal offences that your teacher or that you have focused on in class. So for this video, for example, make sure you know the 4 elements of murder and you also know the 3 elements of assault. And like I said, you generally will have to apply these elements to a case study. So tell me how the element is either present or it either is not present. Secondly, you want to be aware of a couple defenses to crime. So you might get given a murder case study and it might say, explain 2 defenses or explain 1 defense available to the accused that they might be able to use. So you need to be aware of what certain defenses are. You need to know the likely outcome or sanctions of your crime. So obviously when we're looking at things like murder, if all those elements are present, they're definitely going to jail. For things like assault though, you got a couple options. So if it's a minor assault, they might get given a fine, or if it's a more serious assault, they might be facing that imprisonment time. The last 2 is that the trends and statistics. Remember that you just need to know a couple trends or a couple statistics from Victoria and then 1 other jurisdiction. But like I said, it can be any jurisdiction you have learnt in class. It doesn't have to be New South Wales, it doesn't have to be Northern Territory. And just to wrap up is that you need to know the impact of crime on both individual and community. And like I said, have a look at your textbook for some examples, but there's many impacts of crime, so it's very hard to list them all. It all depends on a case-by-case basis. And last but not least, just want to stress this one last time in this video, don't forget your task words. So back to that first video where I spoke about, make sure you know how to explain. Make sure you know how to distinguish when you're getting discuss words. Make sure you're looking at both sides of the argument, for example. It's really important that you nail these task words early, because if you get on top of them now in year 11, it makes year 12 significantly easier. So I know I keep stressing on about that, but it does have a key role in VCE Legal Studies. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next series.